So how do police test for cannabis when you're driving? In British Columbia, there are two different ways that the police can use to test you to determine whether or not you are impaired by a drug. And they do these tests first at the roadside, and then they participate in a later test at the police station. I'm going to only talk about the roadside tests for the purposes of this video. So the roadside test that the police use, the first one, is known as the standardized field sobriety test. And this is the test that you've probably seen on television, where you have to participate in three different performance evaluations. The first one is following a pen or a pen-like object with your eyes to determine whether or not you have something known as horizontal gaze nystagmus, involuntary jerking of your eyeball. The second thing that the police do is they make you stand on one leg for a period of 30 seconds and determine whether or not you can actually do that, whether you sway, whether you use your arms to balance, whether you hop on one foot, whether you put your foot down. The police are looking for signs of impairment in your ability to stand on one leg. And the third test that the police do to check for impairment at the roadside as part of this first series of tests is known as the walk and turn test. That's walking 9 steps forward, 9 steps back on an imaginary line, or sometimes one of the lines that's painted on the roadway, and you have to perform a certain type of turn. Your heels have to touch your toes every step that you take. You have to count your steps. You can't use your arms to balance. Basically a series of walking related tests. Interestingly, none of these tests have anything to do with your actual ability to drive a car. You don't walk while you drive. You don't track an object with your eyes while you drive, and you also don't stand on one leg while you drive. The other test that the police do at the roadside to determine whether or not you're impaired by a drug is the saliva test. And that involves taking a saliva sample using essentially like a tampon that soaks up your saliva. And then they test it in a device doing something very similar to a COVID test where there is a reagent inside the cap that gets mixed in with the actual swab and produces a chemical reaction that activates colors on a strip, which are then read by a laser reader inside the device to determine whether or not you are over a prescribed limit for any type of drug that the device is sensitive to. What's really interesting about the roadside tests is they actually don't detect impairment. For the roadside tests that we do, the 3 series of physical coordination and eyeball tests, those tests have even been studied and found not to be specific to cannabis. For example, the eye test that's looking for horizontal gaze nystagmus, you would not expect to see horizontal gaze nystagmus if you're impaired by cannabis. And the tests have not been validated for use with cannabis impairment. As far as the roadside saliva tester for THC, it also doesn't necessarily test for impairment because it's only testing for a particular concentration of drugs in your saliva, equating that to drugs in your blood, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're impaired by the cannabis. So the roadside tests aren't great at determining impairment, even though they're used for that.